Good evening, and thank you for logging on to Hidden Histories, URBAN-15's monthly e-magazine for cultural and arts in San Antonio and beyond. I want to thank all of those friends out there throughout the United States, throughout the continent, the southern continent, who continually email and contact us about how much they've learned about our little city called San Antonio. This project started as part of the tricentennial celebration, where we celebrated the latest 300 years of our 10,000-year history. And it has succeeded into the second year now. We're in our second season and planning our third. I want to thank particularly tonight the Santigos Foundation, the City of San Antonio, the San Antonio Area Foundation, Film SA, and our newest supporter, Humanities Texas. Thank you for your support in bringing this simple broadcast to so many people throughout the United States and the world. Tonight's show is a little different because we're going to get religious. And we are going to explore one little part of San Antonio's history that we don't ever spend time on. When we talk about religion in San Antonio, the first thing that comes up are the missions. These are our emblematic. These are our brand. This is our statement about who we were as a culture in creating this colonial apparatus called the missions. However, in modern times, we have gone through a number of transitions, and the religions in this town, this is a very caring town, have always been involved with the community. In the early 60s, 1962 through 1965, there was a conference in the Vatican. It was called Vatican II. And Vatican II was a gathering of all the bishops, the cardinals, the major thinkers of the Catholic Church. And they said, what are we going to do for the next century? What do we have to do? Out of that conference, Vatican II, came some major changes about how the church would confront and participate and make better the modern world. And so as that thought penetrated through the society and all the way down to the parish level, San Antonio was a beneficiary of this whole movement, this whole open-mindedness that suddenly sparked and came to fruition in the early 70s, and we're still feeling the positive impacts to this day. So Hidden Histories explores that. Right now, though, let's jump to our most interesting contribution that you, the listeners, and the viewers have made to us, and that's found photos. We're going to watch some photos. They were wedding portraits that were found in a portrait studio. The people never came back to pick up their pictures. And these are found wedding photographs tonight from Lupe Studios, which was on North Florida Street. Thank you for watching our found photos. If you recognized your grandmother, your mother, or even yourself, please contact us. Find us at hiddenhistories.tv. Now, I think the best part of the program, though, is when we find somebody who's made an impact on San Antonio and there's an opportunity to speak to that person live. So welcome to the show, Father. You are emblematic of efficiency, of joy, of caring, of support. You've been a role model for so many of us for so long, and it's an honor to have you here at Urban 15. And we want to talk today a bit about your life, for instance. For a little while, you're been at many parishes throughout the city, and you've been at the cathedral, and now you're with the missions. And why do you do what you do, Father? You've done so much.
Well, thank you, George. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to be here with you. In terms of why do I do what I do, I guess it's because I see it as part of my calling, which I felt at a very young age, to serve people, especially through the church. And I never dreamed that when I entered the seminary that I would do what I ended up doing, namely being the one that restored the cathedral, the one that raised the money and created new buildings in downtown San Antonio, worked on Main Plaza, worked on restoring the missions, helped, the effort to get the World Heritage Site, worked on the papal visit, all those things. There's so many things that happened, and I thought to myself when I entered the seminary, I'm just going to be a parish priest. I'll be one parish after another, and I'll be happy. Well, that's kind of like not God's plan, so you just have to kind of react and respond to what you feel the door opens and what God asks you to do.
So how were you when you entered seminary then?
I was 14 because in those days, way back in the early 60s, I entered in 63. The nuns in my grade school, St. Paul's, were encouraging us, the best thing you can do is be a priest. And at that time, the system of the seminary was you begin right away at high school. And then you just keep going. And if you feel like that's your calling, then you just keep going to college and you keep going to graduate school and ultimately get ordained. Many people drop out along the way, but somehow or another I stayed and I became a priest.
So when you went to college, what was your major?
My major at St. Mary's University was history. And we all had to take philosophy as a minor because philosophy prepared us to study theology at the graduate level. So, but history, I always loved it. So especially history of the borderlands, the Southwest and Northern Mexico and that whole interchange and the whole history of Texas and the Southwest and how Mexico and Texas and how we interact with each other and how much the two cultures have influenced each other. And I grew up with that. I mean, that's my family history. My family got here to South Texas in 1700. So when I'm restoring the missions and the cathedral, I'm basically doing it for my family as well as everybody else.
Well, your family's always involved with service. And can you give us a little hint at just how deep your family has been in service to the community?
Well, my dad was a pharmacist on the west side in the Prospect Hill area. He had a little pharmacy about a block from Sacred Heart Church. And mother was a school teacher. So in both ways, Dad was serving the community through pharmacy. He helped a lot of people. Many times people couldn't afford the medication. He just gave it to them. He would deliver medication sometimes 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. He had little doctor's offices there where people would come. And healthcare was not a high priority at that time for many poor people, and so I think he provided a great service in the area of healthcare. And he was from the barrio, he was from that neighborhood, he knew the people. And mother was a school teacher, and the amazing thing about the two of them was that both of them, Mexican Americans or Hispanic Americans, were at the University of Texas in Austin in the late 30s and graduated in 41. When almost no Hispanics were at the university level. But both of them have an interesting story. They're not from wealthy families, they're from poor families, but both of their family members, in the case of my mother, her mother, in the case of my dad, his older brother, were the ones that pushed them on to school and they got degrees.
So your choice of studying history, your family's commitment to service, it seems like there was the proper preparation for what you went on and did and excelled.
I didn't know that, but I guess you're right.
So in the early days of your pastoral experience, what was the first parish that you were sent to?
The first parish I went to was Immaculate Conception on Merida Street in the near west side. At that time, the stockyards were right there, 2 blocks from the church. It was not a very good smelling neighborhood. In fact, it was horrible. And when I got there, remember the first day, I was saying, this does not smell like panaderias mexicanas, that's for sure, you know. And yet the people lived with that. I mean, when the wind shifted, it was horrendous, and then it shifted another direction, it got a little bit better. But the people of the poor neighborhoods had to live right next to the stockyards and the rendering plants and the hide plants and the whole thing. And it was a tough neighborhood because the city didn't provide a lot of services at that time. When I got to that area, the old corrales were still in existence, where people lived in a kind of a circular way with like the toilet, an outdoor toilet and an outdoor shower in the middle of the complex. I mean, it was just horrible conditions on the west side when I first got there. Things improved, gracias a Dios, you know, things happened and got a lot better.
And we're talking about 1970.
I got to the barrio in 74 as a deacon. I was not a priest yet. I was in my what they call internship year. And so I wanted to study there. I wanted to be in the barrio. I wanted to return there and serve there. And at that time, Archbishop Flores, Patrick Flores, was the auxiliary bishop, the assistant bishop, and he was stationed at Immaculate Conception with Monsignor Charles Pugh. So I was there with both of them, and they were fantastic mentors, terrific people that were very much at the service of the community, very involved.
So you were there with just as the Good Government League, the GGL was still politically powerful, the county was still actually run by the Sheriff's Department in many ways, and the Catholic Church was still much of the old hierarchy that had been there since the 30s and the 40s.
Sure.
So the social issues that you were facing were not necessarily the conversations on the agendas of.
Well, the interesting thing is when I got there in 74, things were changing because Archbishop Fury came in 69. And that was a big change because he was very committed to the Hispanic community, and he decided in the early 70s that he was going to send a lot of young, active priests into the barrio. It was the first time that there was a major commitment by the Catholic Church to really see if they could make an impact in the west side, especially the poorest neighborhoods. And so he picked like 5 or 6 parishes, and he sent a bunch of young, energetic, committed priests, both Anglo and Hispanic, into those parishes, and they made a huge difference. And that's when COPS began, and that's when a lot of the identification with the Hispanic and the Catholic Church began. A lot of the liturgies, you know, we began to do a lot more with Guadalupe, with Dia de los Muertos, with all the different customs and traditions, and there was a lot of life there. There was a lot of energy there. It was an exciting time to be in the church and to be in the barrio.
Had Bishop Fury come in 10 years earlier, do you think that he would have had the power and the right to do that, or are we?
I think he came in at a critical time because the priests and the previous Archbishop, Lucy, had a real coming to kind of butting heads. Lucy was on his way out. He didn't want to give up power. He was beyond the retirement age, and yet he still kind of wanted to maintain control. Now, Lucy, to his credit, was very strong on social justice as well. I mean, for example, he favored the unions, and he was real strong in those areas. But at the same time, when it came to interior things inside the church, Lucy was very, very strong. It was my way or the highway, and that's where the Vatican II had opened up the church, and that's when there was a lot of conflict, and so Lucy basically ended up in conflict with the priests, especially the younger ones. And so when Fury came in 69, he came in to bring the priests together, but also to be committed to making a difference in the community.
Well, it's so ironic that we've had such conservative and progressive orders in our community within the nuns of San Antonio, and they were always, many of them came in as nurses, Sisters of the Incarnate Word, and then others that were more social action, Sisters of the Holy Ghost, Divine Providence, and others that were actually the finishing school nuns, sure, the Ursuline. And so
in the beginning, the nuns were mostly educators and healthcare people, mostly, many of them. And then they began to diversify as the years went by, and as their numbers began to decline. Then they began to get out into the parishes more, into the community more. They began to get into social justice more, those kinds of things.
Now, do you think that, I mean, we're going to talk about Vatican II and its impact, but how much of that change that you were able to participate in and actually activate those priests would have been resisted had it been a prior time within the Catholic Church?
A lot of it would have been resisted, no question about it, because what Vatican II did was, as Pope John said, John the 23rd was the one that started Vatican II. He said, let's open some windows, let's let in some new air, because the church was a kind of enclosed kind of institution. Yes, it was out there in the community, it was doing a lot of good things, but at the same time, it was very rigid in its approach to the world and its approach to church. And so what it did was kind of began the experimentation. Like you were saying, the church was saying, well, what do we got to do in the modern world? What do we got to do for the next 100 years? How's it going to work? And I think Archbishop Fury especially allowed us, by coming in 69, to really fully grasp what Vatican II was all about, and began a lot of experimentation. I mean, the church officially, which today sounds so wild, the church officially said this is an era of experimentation. Try different things, not within certain limits, of course, but we were doing all kinds of things in that time.
I remember the shock of some of in Sacred Heart Parish when there were guitars brought in to the church, and it was Father Matula. It was the priest that brought the guitar mass in.
Sure. And I remember some people complaining about the mariachis. I remember one of the women at my parish said, I did not come to church to hear cantina music, you know. And I mean, that was the reaction. And so you know, it was a real change to bring the cultural music, because they had remembered the organ and a very solemn kind of sometimes Latin music and all that Gregorian
But
chant.
Latin with a capital L.
Yeah, capital L, and not Latin American. Latin music from Latin meaning Rome, and Gregorian chant, you know, beautiful. Gregorian chant is beautiful, there's no question about it. But it was kind of like the only thing, you know, and some of the hymns were the very, very traditional ones. So when music started changing, when the liturgy started changing, when things started opening up, when there was a lot more identification with the culture, especially here in San Antonio with the Hispanic and the Mexican culture, things were very, very different. And we made some mistakes, there's no question about it. But that's what you do when you're learning. You make mistakes, you know? When you're a kid and you want to ride that bike, you're going to fall down a lot, right? You're going to make a lot of mistakes, but ultimately, if you keep at it, you're going to get on that bike. And I think that's what we were trying to do. We made some mistakes, but I think we made a lot of very, very good progress.
Well, within the liturgy, though, the fact that there were readings now that weren't from the Bible, so often at that period they would Desjardins quote, or you know, there was something else or another from a great philosopher or a poet. And then the fact that we had members of the parish that were actually doing the readings, and that had been pretty unheard of up until that.
Plus the fact that the liturgy was then transferred to the language of the people, meaning English or Spanish or whatever language the people who were attending spoke. And prior to that, it was all in Latin. And you'd have your missal, and you'd have your nose buried in your missal because you were translating what the priest was saying in Latin, and it was in your missal in English or in Spanish, whatever language. So the language of the people, you know, the accessibility of the people, the fact that people were now involved much more by becoming the readers, you know, choir members, Eucharistic ministers, actually giving communion. That was a huge, huge change that came on, where people could actually give communion who were not priests or deacons. Again, those kinds of things we had not heard of when we were young, and ultimately now they're very normal things. Everybody accepts them, and it's a wonderful bringing together of all kinds of people, saying that all of us are baptized and called to serve. All of us are called to ministry. Now, how are we going to sort it out? What ministry you do, what ministry I do, and we're all called to do that. So I think that has helped a lot.
Well, part of Pope John's statements and comments were always that we needed to get the church back to where it started, and that was servicing the downtrodden, servicing people that were hungry, servicing people that were sick. And in those papers, he says how he needed, it was important for the church to include the lay members of the parish into doing the service that would have traditionally been just church service.
Correct, just priest people.
So when you get all of these people together in the same roof who are in concept of service, there's a lot of tension.
Sure.
And a lot of the problems of a given community come. Can you do you remember how that got translated into a kind of a social action?
Well, actually it wasn't, I can't say that we invented it, my generation invented it, because, I mean, if you think about, look at someone like Father Carmelo Tranquesi, who was a Jesuit priest who worked in the 20s and the 30s at Guadalupe. And he was significantly responsible for getting rid of those corrales and doing public housing. And people resisted that public housing. It was the first time that many poor Hispanics in San Antonio got a decent home with indoor toilets and lighting. I mean, electricity and things. That didn't exist for a lot of people. So even in those years, and I know obviously in the 19th century there was a lot of back and forth, but slowly then there was in this diocese, the bishops and the priests got more involved in justice issues and trying to serve the poor directly and trying to change things. And by the time it gets to my generation, then the logical thing was to do community organizing, because we saw that it was very effective around the country. And we brought in people who knew how to do community organizing, and we worked through the churches, and it was very effective.
Well, within the church itself, there were tensions.
Sure.
As those priests who felt that the work of God was not organizing a political or a community-based action group, and the work of God was in contemplation and meditation or prayer. And I'm sure that also there was the fact that all of a sudden these uppity Mexican-American priests were becoming popular in their parishes and actually doing stuff. Was there a intense push-pull going on?
There was some tension going on because, for example, some of the people in parishes, in parts of the town, in parts of the city where people were comfortable and where people kind of liked the status quo, they would react and they would get angry and tell the archbishop or the bishop or the priests of their parishes, what are those guys doing on the west side? What are they doing on the south side? That's not church work. They're not supposed to be involved in that kind of thing. And so there was tension sometimes among the clergy themselves and among some of the people who were being affected, because like when community organizing happened and we would confront the power structure, some of them were Catholic. And some of them would then go, specifically the politicians that were Catholic, would run to the archbishop and say, call them off, tell those priests in those parishes over there not to do that. And the archbishop, Archbishop Fury and then Flores would say, I don't run those that community organizing effort. They're not endorsing politicians. They're not doing work for the Republicans or the Democrats. They're doing work for the community. So you go deal with them. You go talk to them. I'm not going to call them off. You go deal with what the issue is, because the issue often was lack of parks, bad drainage. People's homes would flood every time it would rain. Sidewalks, better schools. I mean, just basics, bread and butter issues that people needed in their lives, but that had been ignored for years and years and years. What's wrong with that? And that's really, Jesus going out to basically console people and to work with people and to confront the authorities, as Jesus did many times. That's what we were doing. And so when it kind of hits home, that's when people got a little bit nervous, but I think we stuck with it and I think it worked.
Well, those parishes, particular in flood-prone areas, St. Jude's, Holy Family in particular, the Loma Park area,
right.
Those were very activist churches from the very beginning in organizing and confronting City Hall.
What was going on was that there was development heading north, of course, runaway development, what we call leapfrog development, meaning they would keep going further and further because there would be cheaper land further, and they would develop it with no idea of the impact of when we put all kinds of parking lots and we put all kinds of homes and stuff, what's going to happen downriver or going south from us when it rains. And they didn't think at all about the fact that they were just causing floods to happen all the time, and it got worse and worse in those neighborhoods that you just mentioned. And nobody seemed to care because it was poor people that were complaining. So that was kind of part of the deal.
So how long were you at Immaculate Conception?
I was only there for about 5.5 years because Archbishop Flores came. He was there for 3 years, went away to El Paso to be the Bishop of El Paso for 15 months, and then he came back as Archbishop of San Antonio in October of '79, and he asked me if I would work with him, so I left there in January of '80 and began to work like his chief of staff.
Well, that day at the, I guess it was the Hemisphere Convention Center, the day of his installation, was probably one of the more memorable days.
Well, actually, at the Hemisphere, it was the day of his ordination as bishop.
As bishop?
As auxiliary bishop. Because I was there. It was Cinco de Mayo, 1970. And he specifically wanted it on that day because that's an important day in terms of the Mexican calendar. And that arena, which I forgot how many it held at that time, it was packed to the rafters. And it was an amazing celebration. It was fantastic. I was a seminarian at the time. I think I was part of the choir. And we were just so uplifted by the whole thing. And it was the beginning of many, many things that were going to come after that. So that was 1970. He came back in '79 as Archbishop. And the installation was in front of the cathedral because there were so many people that wanted to go in Main Plaza and the street, because at that time Main Street was right in front of the cathedral. And so all of Main Plaza was redone so that people could basically create a church and attend his installation.
Well, that then pretty soon, within 10 years, you have the Pope coming as well.
He came in '87. That's correct. That was huge and almost killed me because I was in charge of the outdoor mass, and we were planning for hundreds of thousands of people, and it had never been done before in the state of Texas, and so that was a huge, huge, huge project. Thanks be to God, it turned out okay, even though at the last minute we had a terrible storm that knocked down part of the structure where we were going to do the mass. But we recovered because this community is resilient. This community knows how to come together in a crisis as well as when we're doing all kinds of projects together, and it worked out.
As much as I love John Paul, the Pope, I do know that he was kind of concerned about the activities here in San Antonio because of the influence of liberation theology on many of the clergy here in town, and he had just come from an environment where some of the words that we use were antithetical to his.
Well, you got to realize, number one, that when he was, growing up as a young Polish priest, of course, you had World War II, and you had the Nazis coming in, and so he was kind of part of the underground in Poland for the Nazi time, and then the Nazis were quickly replaced by the communists. Okay, so he was part of the resistance to that. Okay, so he grew up with that whole mentality. We don't grow up with that. We grew up in the United States with a certain amount of freedom, and at the same time we know that everything is not perfectly okay here. Everything is not just here. There are rich and poor, and sometimes it's very unfair what happens to the poor. And so when we got involved, it was never a partisan political type of thing. It was always a kind of an issues-oriented thing. We were always affecting, trying to affect the political powers to deal with the issues of the people. As long as they dealt with the issues, fine. But when they didn't deal with the issues, we would give them a lot of grief, and again, we never endorsed anybody. And so what the Pope was very strong, especially in Latin America, like Central America, like Nicaragua, where he was kind of waving his finger, was priests that actually got involved with a political party and either ran as a candidate or were appointed to be like a foreign minister or, a cabinet minister. That was John Paul's line. You could not cross that and remain in the clergy. And so, for example, there was a couple of priests that were congressmen in the United States at the time, and John Paul told them, you've got to get out.
The Jesuit, the Father.
There was Father Drinan was his name, from Massachusetts, but there was another priest, and I believe he was from maybe Minnesota, I can't remember exactly. But Drinan was the most famous one. I think he was a Jesuit, and he was from Massachusetts. And he got reelected several times, but then John Paul simply said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have a priest identified with a particular party. And to a certain extent, I can understand that line of thinking, because I think the church has to remain an arm's length from any political party, because we can't go up or down with a political party, because inevitably, not everything that political party stands for or fights for is going to be what the church believes. And so then as a priest, you're caught, because you're loyal to the party, you're loyal to the church. What are you going to do? So I think it's always better for us to stay out of partisan politics, but to be engaged with the politicians all the time and to be pushing them in terms of the issues that we believe are important.
Well, so much of the environmental movement now, we notice there's a lot of clergy involved in that one. The clean water issues, the whole issues of the use of nuclear power. There's been so much of the church membership that has gotten and made big statements. I just read a letter to Governor Abbott from, I think it's like 80 clergy, ecumenical people against the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So we see the church is still pretty active in these areas, and very, very inspirational to the younger people to get involved with issues.
Climate is the issue right now for Pope Francis. He has made that one of the defining issues of his papacy, because he says what happens with climate change is that the poor get affected disproportionately in a negative way than others. So what's going on right now, for example, in the southern half of the world, especially like around the equator and around Central America, places in Africa, is that poor farmers who are subsistence farmers, meaning they grow and they eat what they grow, and there's not a lot left over to sell. What's happening is they were always depending on the rain to come at a certain time of year, and they would plant their crops accordingly. In the last 20 years, that has changed. They don't get the rains that they used to get. So they put the seed in the ground and nothing happens because the rain doesn't fall, because things are changing. Or they try to grow coffee where you need a cooler climate, and now where they are, it's too warm to grow coffee. So they either have to go up the mountain, or if there's no more mountain to go up, they got to change their crop. And those things are affecting poor all over the world. Desertification, meaning the desert is growing. So I was a witness of that when I went to Africa. In Burkina Faso, which is a country just south of the Sahara is now moving into the country. Every year, a little bit more of the country gets lost to the desert. And what are those people doing? They used to raise crops, now it's a desert. What do they do? And this is what's going on, and that's why Francis is saying climate change is the defining issue of our generation, and we must do something about it. And too many people are denying it, and he stands firmly with the vast majority of the scientists that say it's real, the church needs to deal with it, and the world needs to deal with it.
Wow. That was impressive. Well, we've been talking a lot about the political consciousness and the social consciousness that was starting to arise there because of Vatican II, but we really haven't discussed that within the nuns, there was a consciousness that was happening that was kind of parallel to the feminist movement. It was part of the same energies, the glass ceilings, pay equity, sexism, all of these issues were part of their ministry now. Right. And can you talk a bit?
Yeah, certainly, there's no question
San
about
Antonio
it.
was a hotbed for those.
There's no question about it that, and for Hispanics especially, when Las Hermanas began, because there was a priest association called PADRES, and that was a Mexican-American priest association, kind of got together to begin to say, within the Catholic Church, we feel also left out. Most of our people are Catholic, and yet, where are the bishops? There were, at that time, no Hispanic bishop until 1970, when Flores became the first Hispanic bishop. And so you had that on the male side, but on the female side, it was, doubly, discriminated against, because not only are we Hispanic, but we're also women. And so a lot of things are closed to us that we can never, do. And so slowly, they began to organize, they began to speak out, and slowly things have opened up. Now, obviously, there's still certain things that are not open to women in the Catholic Church, namely the priesthood. But even the Pope said we should have a discussion about the diaconate. They can't get a consensus yet, but he wants to keep talking about it. But in the meantime, in many dioceses, now you have women who are chancellors of dioceses. Now, chancellor is a position of authority. Chancellor is a very important position next to a bishop. And women can do that. You don't have to be a male priest to do that. It used to be that they were always priests. But now, many women, like in San Antonio, we have a woman religious who is our chancellor, doing a fantastic job. Those are the kinds of things that began to open up more and more. Women were already principals of schools. Women were already presidents of colleges. I mean, women were already heads of hospitals. That's a lot of responsibility, and that's a lot of, it takes a lot of leadership to do one of those institutions. So women were already proving that they had more than enough, ability and experience to do those kinds of things. Why not more? So that was the tension that was going on and continues to go on.
Now, in San Antonio, we had a number of leadership people who were fighting for on these causes. One was Sister Yolanda, and she was going to be a guest on our show tonight, but she did have a conference she had to speak at, and we were able to have a conversation with her last week, and she's tough.
Good.
She was really tough. She was one of the most enlightening conversations I've ever had here at Urban 15, and we'd like to move a little bit here to Sister's interview last week. We have the feminist movement, which reaches
Exactly.
mid 60s, early 70s, and while much of that was more about sexuality and freedom, the feminist movement also was about hierarchies.
Exactly.
and glass ceilings and things like that. Do you? I suppose the priests were the most frightened people of when they saw an order and the young novitiates starting to question authority.
Exactly, because I think we were very influenced by the feminist movement. And it was interesting as a Latina, it was, I feel like I had a double door to go through. Because as a Latina, especially in the early period with Las Hermanas, and we were questioning and challenging, and so many of the priests or the men felt like we couldn't really reach the Latina community because they were interested in family, and so promoting rights for women or promoting leadership roles for women would work against the family. And so I remember very well in my early days often being silenced by the men or the priests in terms of speaking as a Latina. And, because, there was the sense that you're not a real Latina, real Latinas are for family.
But it seems like the intellectual class in Latin America, when they use the word liberation theology and they throw a name onto this movement, was that pretty enlightening or frightening to you when you started hearing?
It was enlightening. And with Las Hermanas, when we started Las Hermanas, which Las Hermanas is an organization of initially Mexican American, but really U.S. Latina sisters. And I joined in 1966, and then the organization started in 1971. So it was very shortly after. And so I was in Dallas on my first mission. I was working at one of the treatment center for emotionally disturbed children in Dallas when Las Hermanas came together. And that was pretty amazing because with Las Hermanas, there were two sisters that started it. And one was, and right now I can't think of their name, two sisters that started it. One was from El Paso and one was from San Antonio. The one from El Paso was a Victorinal sister. The one from San Antonio was Holy Spirit sister, Holy Ghost sister. And both of them were being very influenced by the Chicano movement. and had become very active, especially in education politics. And Gregoria, the one from El Paso, had actually been ousted from a diocese for her activism. And so they came together and they just felt like, look, as Latinas, our people are the people that are being hurt the most. Right now, we're probably, the few Latina sisters that exist are probably the best educated women in our community, and we've got to do something. So they decided to start and to bring together the Latinas. And they tried through the diocese, writing to the bishops to have the names of Spanish surname sisters with very little luck. But then they went to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and there they got more of a listing of congregations, and then they wrote to the congregations for the names of Spanish surname sisters. So they sent us all an invitation to come to a meeting in Houston. And in those days still, I mean, you didn't go anywhere without permission or without the superior or without a companion even. And they managed to gather about 50 sisters in Houston for this meeting. Now, some of them, like our sisters, the General Superior accompanied 3 of the Latinas that went to the meeting. And so at that meeting, they decided that they would start an organization for Latina sisters with a focus on how we could better serve our people and be more committed. Because those of us that were in there were all teaching in middle-class schools or working in big hospitals and not even allowed to speak Spanish to the, to the workers. And so, so they had this first meeting, decided to have it in Santa Fe as the oldest diocese in the United States, and in a more Latino-identified diocese. There was a big conversation about whether Spanish-speaking sisters from other countries could be part of Las Hermanas, and the decision was, or Anglo sisters working with Hispanics, and the decision was no. This is about leadership, and it's Latinas that need to develop their leadership, and so the only Latinas can serve in the leadership of Las Hermanas, and only Latinas can be full members. At the first Hermanas meeting, we had a huge battle about whether we would speak in English or Spanish, because the majority of us raised in the U.S. couldn't speak Spanish as well anymore. We spoke it in our families maybe, but we really didn't feel comfortable speaking Spanish. So it was a whole learning process that we had to really reclaim our identity, and we had to reclaim our language. So at that first meeting, there was the whole issue of how we operate. There was another battle about, do we operate with Robert's rules, or do we all speak at the same time, or how we would move forward, claiming our identity, and at the same time, being able to bring some order to the group. So after that first meeting in Santa Fe that I was present at, we all left with a mandate that we would go back to our congregations and we would demand to work with our own people, and because there was lots of need. There were the migrants, to be able to work with the migrants and follow the migrant stream. There were in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, and all the different ways that our people needed us. And so it went differently for different people, I imagine, but what Las Hermanas did is it uncovered a lot of rage that had been there, which happens with any group when you become conscious, when you become conscientized. And so there was the whole rage in terms of being Latina in this society, and being seen as second-class citizens, and being women and being seen as second-class citizens. And so all of that, just really brought this out. And so Las Hermanas initially became a consciousness-raising group for us, with all of us becoming more aware and also more militant, if you will. So then some congregations started forbidding their sisters from joining Las Hermanas because they were seen as too militant. And of course, the priests, initially PADRES was very supportive of Hermanas. Afterwards, I think they had second thoughts about it, because they were saying we were muy machas. And so, So anyway, so with Las Hermanas, then our whole mission was conscientizing ourselves, caring for our own people, getting out in the field. And I always say that was the difference between Padres and Hermanas, because with Padres, it was being able to get into the mainstream of the church. With Hermanas, it was being able to get into the mainstream of the church with a small c. And so the farm workers were a wonderful teacher to Las Hermanas. We joined the farm workers for many of the strikes and pickets, etc. But I remember Cesar saying, until you come out and die with us, we will not get, the attention. Then we can say we are a church together.
Now, going back to the hierarchical pyramid, I went to Little Flower, and those were Carmelite priests.
Yes, and they still are there, I think.
Spanish Carmelite.
Yes.
Some of them from Mexico. They came over in the Cristero refugees and stuff.
Right.
And on the hill we had the Carmelite cloistered
Yes,
nuns.
that's
and what's it
right.
called?
This called Carmelites?
yeah.
Yeah, I think.
One of my things as an altar boy was to take the dirty vestments and the soiled
Whatever from the whole
from the mass and everything, and take them up to the convent.
to be washed.
They would be washed and
And
ironed
cleaned.
by the nuns.
Yes, yes.
And then they would send a car or something because everything was on hangers
Right.
to bring it back,
Back.
from the.
Yes.
And there was something that just like.
You knew this. There's something wrong with this picture.
There's something wrong here, And
Yeah.
there were so many stories at Christ the King also.
Yes.
That the Claretians, the priests
Right.
there, were
With the
very
sisters.
French and very male, and they
Yeah.
would make the nuns do all of their
Exactly.
cooking and their
Yeah.
stuff.
At Mock, they had that was something that always bothered
Really?
me. Even
At
in my
Mock?
day, it was the
Tell me.
nuns. The nuns did the cooking, and so they would rationalize it as saying that it was the young men needed feminine influence. But it's like not that kind of feminine influence, because it's like mother taking care of you, and so that was really
So into
rationalized.
the 80s that was going on?
Yes, yes. And then, with Las Hermanas, we really wanted to get some of those sisters all over the U.S., that there were sisters that took care of seminaries. They did the cooking and the cleaning. And we really wanted them out working with the migrants or, doing pastoral ministry. And we developed a scholarship program, scholarships that they could come to Mock to study pastoral pastoral work so that they could work with the people. We were very unsuccessful in getting them out. Now, some of it is the orders in Mexico depended on the money they earned here to help them out. But I mean, that's, and then.
So the nuns were being paid to work for the priest at
And
the
that's-
seminaries, but the money didn't stay with them. It
No,
went to
it went to
Mexico.
Mexico to the mother house or whatever. And they were, the superior and the obedience and the rules. Because even in our congregation today, we, between Mexico and here, and it's, I would say our sisters in Mexico are probably among the most progressive. But still, you have a church that is much more conservative in Mexico.
Going back to Vatican II, was there a deep discussion as to women becoming priests at Vatican II, or is that something that came as a result of the open-mindedness discussions after Vatican II?
It came after.
Came after?
Because I think at Vatican II, the main thing that was challenging was the clericalism. And so I always think of Vatican II, with my students, I always say we went from the pyramid to a circle. And so in the pyramid, everybody knew their place. We knew that it was the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the monsignors, the priests, the sisters, the lay people. It was like we all knew our place in that pyramid. Vatican II basically extended the tent and made it a circle, and everybody was lost about where do we belong. And so for because it made it our church, the people's church. And so so the main thing Vatican II changed then was the clericalism, the sense of we own the church, we make the rules for the church. to really saying, you know, the church is all of us, and the holiness of the church is extended to all of us, the invitation. And so so then the women's ordination movement really was as a result of being able to think and to question and to propose new ideas.
Thank you for watching tonight on Hidden Histories. I want to remind everybody that we're in a conversation with Father David Garcia, renowned church leader here in San Antonio, who is on the cusp of retirement. Unfortunately, you know, we'll have to keep you here in San Antonio and make sure that you don't travel all over the world. And your thoughts and your ideas that you've had today is merely the preface. It seems like of a good read someday. So I do hope that
I intend to do that. I do want to do some writing about what I've learned along the way. 44 years of priesthood, 56 since I entered the seminary. You know, I've lived all my life here in San Antonio, 70 years. So I have learned a lot, but what I'm trying to do is put it into a form that would help others, so that what I learned by mistakes as well as by successes can maybe be helpful for others in ministry.
Let's take 2 minutes here. I need some clarification. Just what was it that went down between Archbishop Lucy and those parish priests? I mean, we were living there.
The thing I think was, because Vatican II had happened, there were these hopes that things were opening up, that things were going to be a little bit more where the priests could be a little bit more, you know, involved in making their own decisions and being able to, you know, explore new ways of ministry. And Lucy, although he said he supported Vatican II, he was there, when it came to church stuff, he wanted it to be the way it was. He was going to be the top of the pyramid, and everybody still had to kind of follow exactly what he said. But at that time, you know, the doors of the barn were open and everything was running out, you know, and so the priests were saying, no, this is a new era for the church, and that's when the two started hitting. And he thought he could do what he's always done, and the priests were not going to accept it anymore, so they publicly asked him to resign. They had sent a letter to the Vatican, and then they made it public, because he was trying to, you know, start sending them out in every direction so that they could get away from the city, so that they would not be in contact with each other. They would not be able to talk. They would not be able to organize. And that was kind of the last straw for the priests. They were not going to be treated as little children anymore.
So this insurrection, was this happening throughout the United States and throughout the world?
I think San Antonio was one of the first ones in the United States. Now, in other parts of the world, I really can't speak to that. And there were some things going on after us in the United States, but ours was one of the most famous ones and one of the early ones, because it was 1968. That was pretty early. That was like just a couple of years after the Vatican Council had closed. And so important enough that the Vatican sent in an emissary, a bishop from Pennsylvania, to study the situation, what's going on, and to interview all different kinds of people on all sides of the question, and then went back with a report to the Vatican. And then within about 6 months, the Vatican asked Lucy to resign. It was portrayed as they were accepting his resignation, but he was forced out.
So that's part of the book, I hope someday.
Well, some of that's already been written, so I might just add another, you know, chapter here and there.
Well, with that accomplishment, this momentum of priest and the fact that they had the right now to go into their parishes and organize and get people to understand that the church was here to help. Yeah. And we see the rise of community-based organizations that were using the territorial area of the parish as kind of a very solid political base. You know, when you meet somebody, it's not like what neighborhood are you from, it's what parish are you from. Yeah. So parishes were territorial and jurisdictional. Yeah.
And that is a key aspect of the Roman Catholic Church, because the fact that a parish is territorial means that we do not gather people from all over the county, all over the state or whatever. This is the territory we're in. That means that church rises and falls with the neighborhood. So if the neighborhood does well, the church does well. And so it's in the interest of the parish that the neighborhood flourishes, that there be, people that are stable there, that people stay, that people can have jobs, that people can raise families. That's in the interest of the church. And that's why the whole concept of a neighborhood is very important.
We have some pictures from your early days. I believe it's the Martinez Park, where you're with the COPS organization, and you're dedicating the park. And we have, there's this picture there. And
I had a lot of hair then.
is that Beatrice in the picture with you? Or?
No, that's a lady, Mrs. Martinez, because the park was being named after her son, Guadalupe Martinez, who was a police officer killed in the line of duty. He was from the neighborhood, and the church is in the background. What was significant about that park was it was a junkyard run illegally by someone from the other side of town with all kinds of terrible things in it. Chemical barrels and railroad ties and railroad cars and abandoned things, and it was filled with rats and weeds and snakes, and it was horrible. It was immediately in front of the church across the street. So for the people to turn that around and not only clean that junkyard up and find that man, but for the city to buy that property and create a park was a real turning point for that neighborhood.
Now, during this same period when COPS is starting to get organized, we start seeing this emergence of leaders that come out of the parishes that eventually, some of them run for city council, some run for state office, and one of them was a union leader there at Kelly, was Andy Sarabia, and he went on to do the federal lawsuit about the pay inequity between Mexicanos and Anglos.
Sure.
And the fact that there was a glass ceiling that was put up for that would prevent people from being promoted. And unfortunately, Andy passed just recently, just a few weeks ago. And we have found, again in our search, a interview that he did in 2012, and I feel that this is something worth hearing because his relationship to the neighborhood is the relationship to the parish.
At one time, the highway department wanted to build an access road, basically an expressway from I-10 to Callahan Road through Culebra, and we organized against it because it was going to split up all the parishes, St. Holy Rosary, Heavenly Family, West End Baptist, Christ the King. So we organized all of those, and we stopped it. And then after that, that's why 151 is there. And right up over here, all of the streets here were part of the COPS projects, getting the streets fixed up, and this drainage up the road here, where the bridge is. Again, with a lot of this being done with CDBG money. Well, these are painted by the kids from the community here. I don't know exactly what they depict. Well, of course, you always see the Vision of Guadalupe. I went to the elementary school back here. There's an elementary called named Cleto Rodriguez. It used to be called Ivanhoe when I went, and we used to have to cross it's like Breckenridge Park, where you had that water crossing. Well, we had one over here to get to school because of Elmendorf Lake. This was the first library we put together of the 7. What used to happen out here was we used to have a bookmobile that used to stop over at a little shopping strip mall over there called Loma Park. And kids, that bookmobile would come once a week. So if they didn't have what you needed, you had to order it, and then hopefully you get it next week. So when we found out that they had a library master plan that the city did, and they weren't doing anything about it, we created a library action committee, and we went after that, and we took that master plan and revised it and revived it, and so we got 11 libraries, and 7 of them are in COPS communities, and this was the first one. We have this library, the library, Cortez Library over there by Palo Alto. We have Forest Hills, which is further up this way. Bazan, Las Palmas. This is called La Tripa, this area here, because of all the packing plants. Yeah.
Oh, La Tripa is in French.
Because you could smell the stink from the packing plants up on Brasco Street. And so they had actions. The other big actions here at Immaculate Conception was to get air pollution devices. We had the Attorney General come down here, Hill, I think his name was, to meet here with the packing plant people. And then, you know, they did put air pollution devices. But now the packing industry is really deteriorated. You have all these were packing plants. This is a diabetes center, which is now internationally known. But this used to be a TB hospital.
As in tuberculosis.
Yes, right. And as a matter of fact, there's still somewhere down there, they still have these little huts where people would live. And then it became the Grace Lutheran Hospital. And they were going to close it. So the leaders here in the West had actions with the university health system. And this is what they agreed on, was building a diabetes center. And it's been that ever since.
I want to thank Nowcast for donating that film to our show tonight. Nowcast is a group of citizen journalists, community journalists, who are working with handheld video camera, and they are going out into the community, and they're going out to public events, and they're documenting today, because at one point today will be considered history. Yes. Well, Father, this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel that much of the momentum of the city is coming off the faith-based organizations and the social action groups that were inspired by the support from the church. And, you know, if you have anything...
I just want to say I've been blessed that I was part of it. I never consider myself a leader of it, but I consider myself someone that learned a lot through the process, someone that supported it. I was just blessed by time and place to be in the right place at the right time when all kinds of things happen.
Well, we're going to ask you the final question, and that's one we ask every leader. Looking out 20 years, what do we need to, what challenges are going to be facing those of us who are going to continue working in this field? What are the biggest challenges that we need to be aware of?
Well, 20 years from now, first of all, I hope I'm looking at you from heaven. So, but I think that the challenges of 20 years are already with us today, because 20 years just flies by. You know, when you're almost 70 like I am, and you think back on your life and you say, my God, where did it go? So it's on top of us right now. So I think a number of things. In this community, we still have a huge gap between the wealth concentration. You have wealth concentrated in a relatively small percentage of this community, and you have a large percentage of this community that's either poor or very much just working poor people. I mean, just a lot of people. And they will not have access to education. They will not go to the university or college. It's going to be tough for them to barely get by. That's going to be an issue always. So can we do something about that gap? I think one of the things the city's looking at now is we need to begin to invest more in areas that need it, rather than treat everybody equal, because we know when you treat everybody equal, it's not equal. And I think the other issue, of course, is the one I mentioned earlier, and that is climate. What this community can do about climate, we can do a lot. And because sometimes you can depend on the federal government or the international government, many times you can't, you have to do it. And what kind of a world are we going to leave to the babies that I'm baptizing right now? I am terrified for them. I don't know what kind of a world that they're going to have, and I want to do something about it with whatever years I have left to make sure that they have some kind of a world to inherit. So that's going to be an issue. Many other issues like education and healthcare and housing and just quality of life for people. All those kinds of things we're going to have to be looking at.
Well, we'll begin preparing and standing on your shoulders and growing with you. The Hidden Histories is a great mouthpiece. It's a great opportunity. I welcome you back. If you come up with a great project or something we need to know, please come back and get in touch with us.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and also to the audience out there, thank you for the phone calls and the emails and all the ways you're communicating about suggestions for future shows. We have more shows than we have weeks. We have more shows at your suggestion than, we could go to 6 seasons right now at this point. And next month is going to be a blast. We're going to be exploring the bands that came out of a particular neighborhood, particular high schools of McCollum, Harlandale, and Burbank over here. There's been so many rock and roll orchestras, bands, punk groups, conjunto groups that came out of those 3 high schools. And we're going to try to figure out what was in the water at those 3 high schools that produced so many musicians. So Hidden Histories will be running July 1st, 2019. Thank you very much.